and Aotearoa for giving us this space and allowing to do this evening. Thank you very much. I hand over to Vanessa. Enjoy your evening,
Hi,
everyone.
Amazin. Thank you again for joining us. I just want to go into it and might as well just tell us a bit about yourself and your achievements and what you really see yourself doing, how things are going to
Thank
progress
you.
for
So wonderful to
2021
be
for you.
part of ICON
Yeah.
2021. It's a wonderful honor to be part of your first one. Well done. And great to speak to you tonight,
Thank
Vanessa.
you.
So I'm a global LGBT. It was a time when lots of people can bring their whole self to the game.
Right. Exactly. How do you think we can improve our visibility within sports? You know, a lot of people think because I'm tall, I probably should do basketball, which I don't. But, you know, there's so many variety of sports that we can get ourselves involved in.
I mean, this is a conversation that I have all the time around the world of how do we improve visibility? Because when you look at pro sports, you know, there are so few Black and Asian pro athletes that are out. And then if you break that down, there are so few pro Asian athletes that are out per se. And then if you break that down and even further of the ones in the Asian community that are out, and we have to understand, you know, the cultural differences of the challenges and barriers that we face, but also more importantly of, you know, the barriers of racism, the barriers of behavior and unconscious bias, because we continually look at the pro level, but we have to look at the journey of that athlete from childhood, of the first time they step out into the field, that they could be the only Black or Asian kid, on how they're made to feel at that point, and the lack of support that they receive. And usually at that point, they have to decide, am I going to move forward as a 6-year-old kid and receive all this racism and all this homophobia, or am I just going to drop out? And so many of us drop out. But if we decide we can continue, you know, when we get to the youth academy level, we need to think about who is doing the choosing. Do they look like us? For the most part, they don't. So then it comes down to the unconscious bias and behavior as to the reasons why, even when we're really good, and this is particularly so for the Asian community because of the stereotype of what it means to be Asian and an athlete, that, you know, even when we're really good, we're usually not chosen. So then that creates a barrier. If for some reason we get chosen, we're one of one. And then if we make it to professional level, and you see it particularly, and I think football is a really good sport, and the NFL to look at, because, you know, you look at some of these sports and you see, you know, that Black athlete or that Asian athlete, they're one of one, and the amount of racism that they receive, particularly from the fan base. And there's, you know, there's a reason why we have been taking the knee, and there's a reason why Colin Kaepernick started that. So it's like, you know, how do we change hearts and minds? How do we turn this around so younger generations of, you know, youth of color don't receive the same kind of backlash that athletes like myself went through? Is, you know, we have to look at allyship, of how we can be a better ally. We have to have a different kinds of tracks. It's not just about cultivating diversity and inclusion in the athlete space, but the coaches as well, the people that are hiring. I mean, I think NFL is so perfect because majority of the athletes are Black. Majority of the owners are whites. So that's constantly creating a barrier as well of this kind of ownership, and that's, you know, history between African American and, you know, white American community of slavery as well. But it also trickles across so many other sports, and I think you know, we have to do a lot of work in the school system and in the college system around unconscious bias training, and also you know, allyship, and how we can create tracks so Black and Asian and Indigenous people can move through the ranks to leadership roles. Because when you can see yourself in a leadership role, then you can see yourself, you know, being in that role as well, but also, you know, that you have a higher chance of getting chosen as an athlete.
Right. Exactly. What do you find are some of the challenges that the queer BIPOC community face within their community? and even those collaborating within Pride communities?
Sure. You know, we tend to work in our silos a lot. And yes, our communities are very different, but there's a thread that connects us all as well in terms of, you know, the disadvantages that we have from being from the BIPOC community, that the racism that we receive. I think the BLM movement has shown over the last year, particularly in the US, that we're stronger together than we are apart.
Exactly.
And I think we must continually remember our history. And this is something that the Asian community is going through right now with all the anti-Asian racism that's happening. And I think particularly what we've seen in the US, and obviously it's global as well, that we have to continually remember our history, that we were always united. When you look at the leaders in history like Malcolm X, like Martin Luther King, of who he stood up with, and the other leaders from the other BIPOC community that stood with him. And when we remember our history, we then remember that we were always united and we were always stronger together than we were apart. And, you know, that's what white supremacy does. It tries to pit us together against each other, but also divides us, because obviously we're weaker divided than we are stronger together.
Exactly that. What do you think are some ways that we can try and figure out how to develop that?
You know, I think ICON-2021 is a perfect example of cultivating unity, where the community can see BIPOC people across different communities standing together, being successful together. I think conversations like this as well are very powerful. And I feel, you know, the leaders within the community have to show leadership, because if there's no leadership at the top, you can't expect, you know, everyone else to suddenly want to unite. And I think, you know, storytelling is so integral to uniting, because people make this assumption that, well, you know, I'm from the Black community, I'm from the Asian community, you know, my experience is very different. Why should we unite? How can we find some common ground? But through storytelling and sharing our stories, yes, we find there's difference, but we find that we're more similar as well.
Right. What do you find are some initiatives we could like to see from the Pride community to increase at least that sense of inclusivity?
You know, I think, you know, obviously you were saying just before we went live that, you know, you don't have a Black History Month. And months are so important, like having a Pride Month, having a Black History Month, having an Indigenous and Asian month. These are important because we can share our stories. We can invite other communities into our culture, where you can learn about who we are. And then when you have a whole month to celebrate, you know, who you are as a community, then you have this festival-like celebration where you have, you know, virtual events, live events. So other people from other communities who you usually wouldn't mix with would then come to your events. And that starts to create unity, because you start to learn about other people's lives and you start to meet other people that you would not necessarily mix with. So, you know, these are really good starts in terms of how do you bring people together.
Have you found where you are, have you helped in developing any type of programs, whether in the UK or Australia?
I do a lot of work globally in terms of, you know, how we bring communities together, because I've always had this mindset that, you know, we're stronger together than we are apart. And, you know, with the work that I do with governments, I always make sure that everyone's at the table, everyone's in the room, from different community leaders, business leaders, different governments from all over the world, because we can learn so much from each other as well. And, you know, I hope when I am next able to go back to Australia and New Zealand, which will probably be at this point, 2022, that, you know, we can continue to have these conversations, because I say to people, and particularly to the white community, that, you know, who at most of the time when we look at Pride groups are the leaders. And those that are kind of, I suppose, running the show, and the people, pop people, we always have to kind of go to the white community and try and sell ourselves, which it shouldn't be the case. It should be, we should have different kinds of leadership. But, I keep saying that, the face of every country is changing, and it has to be reflective in the work that we do and the festivals that we see.
Exactly that.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I ask you a question, which is a bit off your sports topic, but what would you say to the 14-year-old version of yourself for advice if they were just clicking in tonight on Facebook and not fully out of the closet or discovering who they might want to be? What's the advice you would give them as part of ICON-2021's vehicle, is to tell us about our history, but also help our future?
Sure. I think we're always told that we're not enough, that we're not worthy of this, particularly for BIPOC people, that we're not worthy of the space that we own. And I would say to her that you're enough, and that you've always been enough. And you need to own every single space that you're in, because you're so worthy to stand, in that ground. And I would thank myself for always believing in me, because I had very few people that believed in me as a child, but I always believed in myself, and I always believed through sport that I could make an impact. But I had no idea what that impact would be. And I could never have imagined this journey that I had, because I never thought of myself as an advocate, and I never had, that was not the journey that I had thought I would take. My only thought was, when I was younger, was that if I shared my story with enough people, someone would listen. That was my only goal that I had.
Where do you think that inner strength came from for you?
I've always remained very resilient and gritty. And I feel, my inner strength came from the fact that, I was bullied. And it was a very racist time in Australia, particularly in the 80s and the early 90s. Asian people were just coming in to the country, and Australia felt like it was being invaded by the Asian community. And I think, what I went through, all the racism, and then on top of that, the homophobia, just really toughened me up. I think, there were two ways that you could have gone. You could have sunk, or you could have swam. And I ended up swimming through it. And I had very few people that believed in me as well. And I needed to believe in me. And I think going into sport at a very young age just gave me that laser focus. And I understand how important sport is for kids from the LGBTQ plus community and from the BIPOC community, because it gives us very unique skills. And for many of us, we never gain access to sports because of the money factor.
That's very true.
As well. So, with all the advocacy work that I do, I always have this conversation that it can't be pay to play. We have to provide sport free for young kids, particularly from the BIPOC community, because yes, we can go out and kick a soccer ball, and that's why you have a high percentage, particularly of Black youth, in soccer and NFL. But then if you want to go and play tennis, or if you want to go and ride a horse, or if you want to go and ski, they're just unobtainable sports, because they're seen as very white elite sports.
Wow, so true.
Yeah.
So true. What do you think we can do within the Pride umbrella to raise the awareness of sport within, because our community, our month often looks like a party or a film festival, and we
I think I speak to a lot of prides around the world, and they ask the same question to me. And I say, number one, you have to have a sports officer in your pride team, because if you don't have that, then thinking of how to cultivate sports within a Pride festival and then have those connections becomes really difficult. So you have to create that role of a sports officer, someone who is like myself, has a background in sports, knows how to navigate that area of the community, and also has the connections as well. I mean, and you know, once you have that sports officer, you know, there are lots of LGBTQ sports clubs, and for the most part, they really do want to get involved with Pride festivals, but they have no entry point because there's none of that. There's no sports officer. But I think, as you know, if a Pride festival doesn't have the funding for an individual, nothing is stopping them as a group to pick up the phone, go onto Google and Google an LGBTQ sports team and get them involved and start that conversation that way. Like, there's no excuse.
It's true.
You can't, you know. I mean, it's that same excuse with the BIPOC community where I had this conversation with Pride festivals. It's like, why can't we see each other? And they're like, well, we couldn't find anyone. It's like, what do you mean you couldn't find anyone? There's like so many of us in the community. Even if you just randomly Google, you will find us.
True. True. Thank you. Does that me on notice for next year? So I've got.
Yes. So how do you feel being a part of ICONs at the moment? ICONs 2021.
You know, when you contacted me, I thought how wonderful in New Zealand. You know, I always think of my own community, of how we see very little of ourselves, particularly from the LGBTQ community. And, you know, New Zealand has such a high percentage of Asian people. Many of them are immigrants. Some of them are second and third generation, but we struggle so deeply culturally being from the LGBTQ community. And I know how important it is for someone who hears about ICON 2021, looks through the list and suddenly sees like an Asian person. And in that instant, they see a mirror image of their own story reflected back on them. So for me, it was like obviously a tremendous honor, but I always think of, you know, what it means for that other person, because I used to be that person when I grew up. And even now, you know, I very rarely, you know, look in the media or turn on TV and see someone that looks like me who is also from the LGBTQ community. I mean, you know, Asian people, we still only make 1% of leading Hollywood roles. You know, if I go back to sports, at the last Olympics, there was a comment that, oh, we've never seen so many LGBTQ Olympic athletes at the last Olympics. And I had to say to the sports community and governments around the world, you have to change your language. It was, we had never seen so many white LGBTQ people at the last Olympics, because there were no Black LGBTQ people, you know, no BIPOC people, no Asian people. So I know what that means. It's like a revolution when you see yourself for the first time. And so that's what I think with ICON 2021, not just for myself, but for so many others, you know, who are part of it, that people are seeing themselves for the first time and what that means. And, you know, what that means in terms of what you have just given the community, which also then means it has to be an annual event.
Can I go from tears to shock?
That was a good segue. 2022.
Thank you, Amazin. I'd first of all like to say, with our collection of 28 people, it wasn't just myself and Vanessa and Raf and other people helped. And we did have a big table discussion about being inclusive. And that's something we can all improve. I know I've got personal development to do on being more inclusive. And I think hopefully we can take people on our journey of being more inclusive. But thank you.
And what I loved about ICON 2021, when you contacted me, and then obviously when I went on your website and looked, is that you included Asian voices, because so often we're excluded from the table.
Right.
And I'm calling people
Definitely.
out all the time, but, about, how invisible and marginalized our voice is within the community. So that's what I celebrate. And you've done so well to make sure that, everyone's at the table.
Thank you. Tear in my eye. Actual eye sweat. I sweat. I swear. Yeah, I mean, I'm gutted that we're the first, because we shouldn't be, and let's hope we can, if we don't make it an annual event, that somebody else picks up the torch and does it better next year, So, yeah. I've got another question regarding sports. During competitive times, was it difficult being an competing on that, where a lot of people are still in the closet or other people are still quite homophobic? What's that journey been like?
I was never out, for a start. When I started, I started at 6 bodybuilding, very, very young, and I started competing in my teenage years. And bodybuilding and like the sport of, going into the gym, it's a very heteronormative, very white, cis male, very masculine, very misogynistic, very sexist, can be sport. And I learned very quickly from the bodybuilding community, from being in the gym environment, from the bodybuilding magazines, that I could never be out. They just did not accept LGBTQ people in sport. And the one man that did come out, that I saw, he lost all his sponsors. The federation turned against him. The federation that owned the bodybuilding media as well, they made it very heterosexual after that, and they made it very clear that LGBTQ people aren't welcome. And even bodybuilding today, we've had so few out people in bodybuilding. I mean, they find it very hard to accept women with muscles because of the very rigid gender norms in bodybuilding, and the competition in bodybuilding has changed a lot because, the muscular physique women competitions, they've actually pretty much taken that out, and now it's bikini fitness.
Yeah.
And to compete in that, you have to have breast implants, you have to wear a G-string, you have to wear heels. It has completely turned on a 360. So for me, I just never for a moment thought I could ever come out. So it just wasn't something that I ever thought of. I just suppressed that and just focused on my weight training and my career as a competitive bodybuilder. It's only really in recent years that we have seen this kind of athletes activism and athletes coming out and being able to be openly out in sports.
Wow. So first of all, like to say to everybody, I apologize for technical issues earlier in the broadcast, but we're back. Amazin, is there anything you'd like to say as we head towards our wrap up?
It's been such a pleasure being part of ICON 2021, having this conversation. I think these conversations are so important because this is what brings community together, and this is what unites us. And I think for so many people that listening are in and who have found out about ICON 2021, I think it's probably become such an important thread within Auckland. And even though when you're doing something yourself, sometimes you can't feel the impact because you don't tend to get people who personally come up to you or personally message you to say how impactful it is. I know it's very impactful, and I haven't kind of seen something like this in different parts of the world. So this is an example of something that can be done in other parts of the world of how we can bring people together.
Thank you.
Oh.
Well, everybody that knows me just knows that I just did me. So thank you very much. And that was a wonderful conversation with Amazin LeThi. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you.
I hope everybody enjoyed this tonight. Icons try to do our best. Kia ora, everyone. Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Have we logged off?